Class. Thank you for your um, uh, exegesis of the chronology of the steps of a spiritual walk.
Yes, yes.
On my way over from the Council of Baptist Pastors group, I was able to listen online a little bit to hear your commentary. I had to leave the church to go over today to help to participate in something the council is doing in this evening sessions once a month, and today's discussion was on growing up PK, growing up a preacher's kid primarily, and in some cases PK means a pastor's kid as well. So
Right.
So there was a full panel of next generation preachers' kids, many of them the age of my children, that were serving and sharing tonight, and then Bishop Williams and others who are pastors who were there. Basically, I benefited by sitting and listening to our children talk about what it meant for them in their generation to have to grow up, as a preacher's kid. So, it was very interesting. Listening to commentary that I have had the capacity in my own life to share over time, because not only do I have children and now grandchildren who are, part of the Preacher's Kid family network, so to speak, but I myself grew up in a household. I was talking to Deacon Johnson on my way back over, and was sharing with him that my father was called to ministry when I was about the age of about 5 years old. So when I was born, he was not a minister. Deacon Johnson asked me, was my grandfather a preacher? And I told him no, my grandfather was not, but his father was.
Oh, wow.
So
Skip one generation.
Yeah, so my great-grandfather was a preacher whose name was Steve.
Oh, wow. Great-grandfather.
Yeah. So he was a preacher.
Oh, right. Your great-grandfather.
Yes.
Right, yes.
So the Steve name came alive in that generation. He was a preacher, never heard or knew much of anything at all about him, unfortunately, in terms of history left or anything that's recorded about it, other than some of his siblings. They had somebody, I think, when they were trying to name one of his daughters after him, and they thought it was going to be a Steve, and it wasn't, so they called her Steve Anna. So I got a great aunt named Steve Anna. That's an interesting name. Back there in the South, they do those kind of things. But my grandfather's name was Bishop.
He was a bishop.
They called him. That was his name. He was not a clerical bishop. But his name was Bishop.
Oh, that's it.
So when they called him Bishop Bland, they literally was calling him Bishop Bland, but he was a long way from being a bishop. At that time, I wish I could come to know him. He was a hardworking man. They called him BB for short, which my Uncle BB got his name from, because he was the junior. But my grandfather actually was a property owner. He was a sharecropper. He had to work hard, to gain his freedom and his ability to try to earn pay. He never was in slavery. The generation before him was, on both sides of my family, but he had to sharecrop because he got skipped in the time of Reconstruction. Of course, you remember only a certain period of time did blacks have a chance to experience a level of true freedom after what we call Juneteenth. But Juneteenth didn't last very long in America. That's why we have to know your history to understand we've not been able to ever experience the promises of Juneteenth and Jubilee for any significant length of time at all. From the time of that emancipation, and folk looking and seeing how quick we were able to rise in areas of business ownership, the issues of being senator. There were first two black senators came during Reconstruction. So we always look at Senator, Obama or Shirley Chisholm or Carol Moseley Braun as the first black senators, but there were 2 black senators in Reconstruction long before them, but they were discounted because they wanted to erase from the record that in a short period of time we elevated in every area of life: politics, business, right, faith, religion, you name it. And that's where we built up Black Wall Street. That's where we built up again the Tulsa area. And there are many pockets around the country that within that short period of time we call Reconstruction, there was black excellence and black growth for people who came out of slavery. That's why it's always interesting when people always want to act as if we were or have been people who were dumb, illiterate, untrained, undeveloped, didn't know what to do, etc. If we were all of those things, how could we not only build our own after people had taken our own, but we actually helped build it first? If there's anybody who could talk about making America great again, black folk can, because we made it great the first time. A MAGA hat wearing people can't claim that really, truly, like folk who actually literally did the labor and did the work. 13 colonies in that experiment may not have survived had they not had a labor force. Had they not had the labor force, I mean, if you got free labor and free rent, I mean, you kick the people who are on the land off and then you get people to come work the land for you. Success is pretty imminent. I mean, But those 13 colonies did not do that because they went and got people they wanted to teach and train how to be a blacksmith. So now this, and I say that to say for those who know, in my sermon Sunday, I mentioned about Florida Education Board. Now I'm talking about teaching a history that says that slavery benefited blacks because it taught them a marketable skill like blacksmith, etc., as if we had no skills or anything to offer, toward that. Well, again, these are the same people that came from people who built pyramids that ain't fell down yet. So you really think you had to show us how to be an architect? I mean, we came from people that were the founders of science, and most of the science that we currently know. They were doing delicate eye surgery when Europeans were in caves. So you really think we had to tell us that? We built the agabus, the whole methods where we get our mathematics system built, the hieroglyphics, where we get our alphabet from for most of the world. So you really think you had to teach us how to read and write? No, there were some things we had to learn in a different context, in a different way, but you did not hijack ignorant people. You did not bring to America. Van Sertima wrote a book, They Came Before Columbus. Dealing with, there were people even who had inhabited some of the land even prior to that. And the whole movement of not knowing your history and whitewashing your history, revising your history, has been tried before. And unfortunately, it did not survive because people who knew their history kept the oral tradition alive, etc., but they're trying it again. And the unfortunate reality is we have a generation now, if you don't know that history, if you don't know your people or where you come from, and like me, who again, I never met my grandfather, but I can tell you and walk through the things that he not only did, but I can tell you the things that kept him from doing what he could have done. Because in that same context where again, his parents and others taught him a marketable skill, he passed it on. Sharecroppers basically did work, much work, but got very little pay. That's different than it was in slavery, but that the law, if the federal law came and says you can no longer own these people as property, that's what emancipation meant. You got to remember, all these folks talking about they wanted to benefit you, they owned people. I don't know what part about that that we trying to whitewash and change the history. By law, they owned people. People were property. They sold us on markets. They owned people. The presidents owned people.
Make it plain.
The government, everybody who was white male property, they owned people. They sold us like cows and pigs and chickens. So how you going to say you really cared about teaching somebody a marketable skill when all we were was property for you to make money from? So when the law came along and emancipated us and said we were more than 3/5 of a human being, said that we had a soul basically that was worth saving, which we fought for through abolitionists, there were people who used religion to try to keep us
That's right.
with a slave mentality. That's the reason why we fight in Bible class, to make sure that you understand not that you're just a Christian, but what kind are you?
That's right.
You know, are you the John Brown, you know, Richard Allen, Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, Sojourner Truth kind of Christian that fought to properly exegete and explain the Bible? Or are you one of those Christians basically that use the Bible to keep people enslaved? Because the evangelical quote-unquote mentality of those for that era was to use religion as the opiate of people to try to keep them as servant or subservient to other people. That is not the liberation theme of a gospel. So you got to make sure you're studying the right thing when you call yourself a Bible student, and you got to make sure you are worshiping the right Jesus when you call his name. Because the Jesus of Nazareth did not come to endorse slavery in America. Neither did he come to endorse the shareholding capacity by which my grandfather and other black folk and other people, brown folk and other poor white people as well. Because remember, there were some white slaves before there were ever black ones too. They were concerned about money and making it. So wealth was the key for many people. But my grandfather was not just killed because he was black. He was killed because he became a property owner. He was killed because he got to a place where he saved his money, organized. I told you, he wasn't a preacher, so he became a businessman, and he became the owner of the general store that he used to have to work and clean, and he worked with people and for people. He could buy back the very institution that in sharecropping you weren't ever supposed to get out of debt. That's why Jubilee was about it. If you're going to be a Christian and practice it, after so many years, debt was supposed to be released. For many of them, they was never going to get out of debt because the interest, the amount of money they paid, etc., suggests as long as you were a worker for those property owners, you don't have to be a slave. You're going to be indebted to them. They may have paid you, but they paid you so little, and what they required of you was so much, you would not probably get out of debt for a lifetime unless they had a good heart to actually give you something fair to work for, and if you achieved it, they kept their word. Many of them, if they earned their freedom, etc., they tore up the paper or lied to them just like they did about voting. You know, kids, if you couldn't vote and control the laws, they could do what they wanted to do. You know, if you were trying to vote to change a law and they asked you to count how many jelly beans was in the jar or how many bubbles in the bar of soap, they kept you from participating in the process to change the laws. That's why they wanted so desperately to get people registered to vote, to participate. The very thing we are failing to do now. They died looking for that so they could change and make folk, at least in a democracy, keep its word. My grandfather was one of those people who earned the right to own that store. And then as in his popularity, now again, he also owned a bowling alley so kids could play. He made moonshine for the community, so again, they liked him because, again, you know, he kept everybody happy, right? You know, and so he was known and popular, but some the old adage they used to say, when you got too big for your britches. That was the adage they said, when you got too much or growing too fast or doing too much, then instead of them outright killing them, they paid off somebody who looked like him to take him down. So in 1950, unfortunately, he was shot and killed standing coming outside his property when my father was in the army at the time. And my uncles and others who were there at home, and they had to literally sell. I was saying to Deacon Johnson that he told my grandmother the night before he was killed, if something happens to me, sell everything and move to Chicago. So obviously, either the Holy Spirit or somebody in the community had told him that his life was in danger. And within 24 hours, it turned out to be true. And so she did what he said, because she knew if she did not leave, my father, my uncles, my aunt who was a baby would not have probably lived very long, because they would have been trying to retaliate against the people. But if they had gone after the folk who literally pulled the trigger, they wouldn't have got the ones who actually did the deed. So you would have just done what you see in the streets today, got black folk killing black folk, while white folk or other folk who actually caused the issue walked away, you know, and basically got double for their trouble. So she listened to her husband. I had my oldest aunt who already was a beautician in Chicago, and my Uncle BB, Bishop Bland Jr., was there. So they moved there, and again, long story short, that's how our family got there. And it was there in Chicago that my father met my mother, and it was there in Chicago, my father working for A&P Food Stores, became a businessman, learned. He again, at 18, his father showed him how to grow, but he used those marketable skills. If you want to talk about who taught them marketable skills, it was their fathers, of those community men who taught them those things. It wasn't white folk was forbidden teaching them anything that didn't make them money. The skills that they picked up were done to reveal family. They were taught by other people in the village, in the community. And they were not necessarily biologically related, because they were splitting up families. So the village taught all the boys how to do certain things. All the young girls, the big mamas, dealt with that. Remember, our women raised their families. They couldn't raise their own kids. They didn't have to work, but they didn't know how to raise their kids. They raised their kids. So if they were so dumb and ignorant, how did they have all the skills to do all the things that we ended up doing? And I'm only saying that to help paint the picture of how we straighten out revisionist history when it tries to come in and report something different, because that's in line with what we've been studying in biblical text. Because my Sunday sermon, for instance, and we can use that as a platform for that, and it ties into what it meant for me growing up PK. I listened to some of those pastors' kids who basically were saying the last thing they ever wanted to do was become a preacher. And I was one of those people too. You know, like my grandfather, Bishop Black, I wanted to become a businessman. I wanted to, you know, make money for the family and ensure the fact that my mama did not have to grow up in poverty. And, you know, I wanted to do what every boy wanted to do. If you was a basketball player, the first thing you wanted to do, go buy my mama a house. You know, I want to be able to do that. Not that my daddy wouldn't have nowhere to go, but I'm just saying I was, you know, a young man who loved his mother. And so I wanted to help lift them, but I knew that based on the salary that I saw my father sacrifice in order to pastor the Lord's people and go from where he had built up to move from a bag boy all the way to regional manager of A&P Food Stores, and then walk away from that to go pastor a church in a small town in middle central Illinois for 25% of the salary that he had built himself to walk away from. That's a sacrifice I wasn't willing to make. You know, just looking at it as a preacher's kid. In other words, you the pastor, you the preacher, that I don't have that call. And when you actually experience in your own life God's hand on your life, to know what it was personally, what the Lord walked him through or what he went through, to understand that God has a burden for his people, and he chooses of whom he will to put and place that burden so that we carry out that word and that walk. I'm grateful at some point that I had the ability to see the integrity that my mother and father kept before me, because my mother, again, she was a college student and would have graduated as one of the best retail dressmakers in Chicago. But she became a pastor's wife and a housewife and left college, didn't finish, so that she could help support the family and raise 4 children, right? So that, because these are the days before daycare. You know, there were no daycare agencies where you could go drop the kids off and things like that. They weren't going to have their kids running all over acting crazy, except she was there to make sure that our developmental years was there. Even as we got to be school age, she went and volunteered at the school we went to school at just to make sure we wasn't cutting up at the school. That's the worst thing in the world to have your mama up at the school and you not even the teacher, so she could walk. She went on payroll so she could walk around whenever she wanted to. But thank God for their concern about, you know, life kids, and they could also speak to the lives of other kids. And in the ability to do that, our community stayed contiguous. We passed on knowledge. We had the capacity not to believe the lies people tried to say about us or to us, about our own history, about what, because we were there with each other. One good thing about segregation is it kept us all together in our communities, listening to each other, whether it be in church, whether it be in community organizations, whether it be in the neighborhood, whatever. And so we were not able to believe the lie as quick as people now who have been so dispersed in places you don't know where you're getting your news or your truth from. I dare to say most folk don't even realize what's happening, you know, to them or to their communities around them, because they have gotten to a sense of malaise and sleep that if you really want to talk about woke, you ought not be afraid of being woke. You ought to be challenging people to be woke, because folk have literally gone to sleep about what is actually occurring. And let me use that as a backdrop to discuss, maybe as a follow-up to Sunday's sermon, and I mentioned John 9 as that. And so let's take a shift into John 9 and use the text, the biblical text. And I took that John 9 text and I leaped a connection with Luke 4:18. Took a cause out of that. And Jesus is healing a young adult blind man in John 9. So the connection that I made with Luke 4:18 was that Jesus was not just an opportunist going around trying to draw big crowds, trying to raise a mega church. In many cases, whenever he got to multitudes, he left them to go to a place remote away from them. He could have easily, you can get a mega church if you feed 5,000 men fish sandwiches in a desert place.
That's right.
They'd have followed him anywhere he wanted to go if he wanted to organize. But mega church seeking was not his ministry nor his mentality. He left them and went to a desert place, went to the other side just to go help one man. So most of his ministry was about discipling. It was about raising up people for maturity, as you just talked about, the age of maturity, and helping people grow in that time and development so that they could actually carry out a mission and a mandate. But you got to know what that mission is so that he knew that his life wouldn't be long. He never got past 33. But he wanted to raise up a mission mindset in his mentees so that after he died, they could carry out that mission, because they weren't toddlers. They weren't babies. Now, again, most of them weren't mature as they should have been. But he put the work in to make sure they were developmentally at least growing on that spectrum. And the Holy Ghost did the rest of the work. But part of that Luke 4:18, if you don't mind reading that for us, Reverend Carr.
You want me to go to Luke?
Yes, we can look at Luke's version, or you can look at Isaiah's version that he read from if you want to, in Isaiah 61, either one.
Okay, Luke 18.
Luke 4.
Luke 4, I'm sorry.
18th verse.
Okay. Luke chapter 4. And
I trust those of you who are YouTube watchers and Facebook watchers are still in tune with us today as we kind of make this transition. Go right ahead.
Luke chapter 4, starting at verse 18, and it says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind.
Okay, so just that part there. And before he goes to set us free, the captives and the year and preaching the year of Jubilee, I was captivated by that recovering of sight to the blind. That was the basis of my sermon from Sunday. It suggested to me that even in Jesus' day, he knew part of his mission would be not only to deal with the poverty issues of the poor, the issues of the oppressed and the bruised, but he also had a mission to remove the scales from people's eyes that had been blinded. And my argument is that these are not just the physically blind that he actually did do because he wanted to be some kind of Benny Hinn type miracle worker. I mean, I'm just to use an example of a modern day example. But he also wanted to remove people who were blind to what was happening in their community and in the world. So his teaching was more apt to remove that blindness when he was trying to help them to see the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, of the religious order, of the Roman government, of those who would. That was the recovery of sight to the blind that was more pronounced than even him laying hands on Bartimaeus. So while he did help the physically blind, he also was helping people through his teaching to not remain spiritually blind.
Spiritually blind. Yes.
The reason for his Bible classes and mine is not to just have prayer lines and bless all and help people to get it, because I can help you get over your one-time malady, but you ain't got to come every week for those kind of miracles, right? And usually those miracles were just used for signs to bring authenticity to the person by which God was using to not foretell but forthtell. That is, speak a word of truth about what was happening in the world.
Yes.
They was used to legitimize, to let people know this is my prophet. Not to go into business for profit. Too many of those persons who have been utilizing the cloak of religiosity is using now those means of miracle working as a means of every week, every day, every service, every event ability to just try to help people with physical malady. Well, go in the hospital business. And I'm not trying to cast dispersion, but if that's all it is to it, then you can have more of an effect.
That's right.
If you just go to Beaumont and go raising up some people over there. I mean, if you really want to help people with physical infirmity, then again, go put some doctors out of business. What I'm trying to help us to not be blind to is that could not be Jesus's only thing that he wants us to do. If that was it only, then our best effectiveness is to go where the majority of them are located. So I'm not discounting the fact he did not go by the pool of Siloam or the pool of Bethesda, but that was not his mission. His mission, based on that, was to recover blindness at every level. So where are we blind now? Because I would argue that physically blind folk can see better than people with 2 eyes and 20/20 vision. I would argue that if you got eyesight but know you more than somebody who ain't never seen a day in their life. He really wants to come to help not one but every dimension of blindness. Physical, emotional, mental,
yes,
social, psychological, spiritual, right? Political. Whatever arena you want to deal with, he doesn't want you to be blind to what's really going on. Be clear about the place you live, about the government you serve, about the people you make allegiance to, about the people, about the things you serve. Understand it and be accountable to it and hold it accountable. Now, part of Bible study is to use the Word of God, and I got my iPad and I got my physical Bibles and others toward that. As a matter of fact, I got a special Bible I'm going to talk about here in a minute, to hold people accountable for what they see. Now, let me just shift to a conversation with you now that I've kind of laid out this kind of thing. Do you recall, and I'm glad you weren't there to hear my sermon Sunday, you had to preach yourself Sunday to deal with others, so you wouldn't hear the answer to this, but I just want to see if I can test your own knowledge. Do you know the four-letter word that has been used, another word to use for prophet biblically or practically?
For prophet?
Yeah, four-letter word. Give you a clue, starts with an S.
For prophet. The prophet or for
or
prophet?
any prophet.
Oh, for any
prophet.
prophet.
For Prophet.
Oh.
So, four-letter word starts with an S.
Starts with an S, four-letter word.
This is one of those online curveball things I'm trying to.
You got me, Pastor.
All right. And I did this for the sake of those people who may have missed my message Sunday. But a four-letter word used for prophet, most folk don't realize, but again, I just want to do that. That's what Bible study does in educating, was a word spelled S-E-E-R.
Oh, I was going to say that, seer.
Seer.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right, seer. Which basically suggests that a prophet ought to be able to see.
Mm-hmm.
The prophet was the seer of the community. The preacher, pastor, prophet, because we occupy various offices, right? We have looked to our pastors, in many cases historically, as not only priest, but prophet. Because we need to we would come to church to find out, what do you see? What is going on in the community? What does the Lord say about the stuff that's happening to us? Is there any word from the Lord? Was the word for ancient Israel? It was a word for modern day Palestine, New Testament, but it's the word for every era of life that we've lived, even in these years that we've been occupying an American context. People still come to church, or ought to come to church, to ask the prophet, what do you see? The problem with too many people is the blind are leading the blind. You can't help people go anywhere if you can't see where it is they are to go, or if you have no idea how to get them there, or if you're not even interested, if you can see, in telling people what you see. Because if you're like the person who took advantage of people, then you can tell blind folk what you want them to tell them, because in the land of the blind, a one-eyed man can be king. You ain't even got to have two good eyes in your land of the blind. So if people don't know, you can tell them anything, and like what's happening in the church world of those days, you can profit off of people who don't know. My people perish for a lack of knowledge. Isaiah 6, when he says to Isaiah, call him as a prophet, he says, here am I, send me. He tells them the next verse, go to my people because they have ears, but they do not hear. They have eyes, but they do not see. What is he saying? Just because you got the physical attributes does not mean you understand the things you ought to be telling folk, because you got to listen, you got to hear before you speak. That's why you got 2 ears and 2 eyes and 1 tongue and 1 mouth, because you ought to hear and see more than you say. And you ought to hear and listen before you say. One of my blandisms is, if you learn how to listen, God will show you how to speak. If you learn how to observe, God will show you how to speak. So the seer was the prophet who would tell people what they saw and what God said about what he saw. That's what Old Testament text, primarily, the prophets is doing. Telling you what we saw, what God said about what he saw. So take that statement, recovering of sight to the blind now, and let's translate it to the blind man's text that I dealt with. So help me now if I jump to John chapter 9, and let's go to John 9, and you know, that's the text where Jesus heals the blind young man, tells him to go wash the pool of Siloam, man born blind, etc. Mm-hmm. And verse 10 suggests in John 9 that folk don't like it when people who once were dealing with a malady and now all of a sudden they get healed. In your understanding of biblical text as well as the world at large, why is it, Reverend Carr, that people get mad when you get healed, particularly by the one who proclaimed that he came to do it because he's doing what he said he wanted to do? But why do people get mad and upset when you actually are elevating and doing the things that help build society and not a menace to society? Why is it that people get upset about that? In your estimation, in the both biblical context and even in the day of the age? I mean, what is your assessment of that?
Well, you know, you have a couple of things going on. One, the person who is actually doing the healing or deliverance, you know, they gain a credit and a credibility that others don't want them to have because they're not our guy, or they're not our choice, or they're not our person, or they're not our candidate. You know, again, just like politics, right? Wouldn't it be nice if we all could just get together, vote for the most qualified person? But it don't go that way. You vote for the person associated with your party. You vote for the person who's associated with you, and there's a lack of genuineness and authenticity, you know, in that type of behavior. But you know, you see that a lot. You cover up the issues of your person, and then you try to expose the issues of the other person. So I think it has a lot to do with a partisan mentality. So that, you know, that's one issue.
And we're becoming more and more, I guess, partisan, even as we speak, right? I mean, the world is shifting, and the church is contributing to that partisanship
in a big way.
Yeah.
The church that's supposed to be no respecter of person,
right?
You know, is very much so much so that we're embracing individuals who are just downright wrong.
And somebody asked me Sunday and said, "Well, Pastor, I thought you were a Democrat." I said, "In many cases, I do vote in a issue that may line up with it, but again, I'm an issue person and I'm a critical thinker. You can't label me any particular way, but I identify with a lot of the issues that right now currently align with that, because there was a time when the Democrats we're dealing with now were the Dixiecrats or the Republicans of the other. So you got to be careful about how you use labels.
That's right.
Because at one time, black folk aligned with what was then called Republicans.
Republicans, that's right.
You know, the Abraham Lincoln type Republican. So you got to know your history. So people will always try to tell you I'm Republican because it ain't the same group. It ain't the same thing. Just like some of the groups that have morphed and changed over time, even biblically, you got to check to make sure you're dealing with the right and same people. Just because you look at ancient Israel in the Bible, you can't equate that to some of the Israeli issues that you see happening under a Netanyahu regime. They're not the same connections. You got to do your work and your research. Now, it's holding the Bible study. I'm not trying to raise that issue today. All I'm saying is, while there are some connections that are clear and are right, you can't make everybody with a title and a label be what they call themselves. Just because I put a Cadillac bumper sticker on a Kia it does not change the engine to a Cadillac. It does not change the transmission to become a Cadillac. It does not change the infrastructure, because what makes it a Cadillac is you got to change all the parts out, right? And the body and the style. But putting a label on it,
yes,
ain't gonna change it. So the challenge with us is we think just because we put a label on people, it changes what they are. You say you are Christian, but if your label says one thing, but your content and everything else about you says something else, then I got to deal with what I've inspected, I see, not what your label says.
Yes.
So
indeed.
Based on your assessment of that, part of what Christian education and Bible class is all about is helping to make critical thinkers. So when somebody asked me about what I was, I said, well, why did you ask me that? Well, you jumped on the Democratic Party on Sunday. I jump on everybody because I'm a critical thinker. I wasn't after quote-unquote Democrats, just like I ain't after quote-unquote all Republicans, even though a lot of them may fall in that basket. But again, if you are not doing specifically what I'm saying, then don't deal with the label, deal with what's in the bottle. Deal with the content. So when I went back and played back what I said, I went back to deal with the issue of why Obama, or President Obama, happened to win an election, and in that election he had to go against the party line, hardline, mainline Democrat. That's a true statement, because many of the people who were in the party, quote unquote, similar to the text that I was dealing with, I was equating it to the text I was preaching, because in the text, they went to the boy's parents to get the boy's parents to make the boy tell them something that would indict Jesus. Because they wasn't after the issue of Jesus healing his blindness. They were trying to entrap him to see if he did it on the Sabbath day.
Yeah, which is the second issue, is jealousy.
Right. They were haters.
They were jealous.
They weren't trying to, they should have been able to say, Jesus, you know what, I don't like your politics, man. I don't like nothing you do, but, man, that boy been blind a long time. And, he's one of our young adults, and now he can help the community. So, I got to give it to you, man. You all right. You all right with me. I may not agree with everything. That ain't what they were doing. They were trying to find a way to take this boy's blessing and find a chink in the armor and misfortune to try to hang him with, and use the boy and his miracle as their bludgeoning tool. Isn't it something people take your blessing and try to make it somebody else's pain? They take what your advancement is. This ain't the first step. If you look at the man in Mark chapter 5, the demoniac man in the tomb, Jesus left the mesmerized multitude I talked about. He fed all them folk, went after that one man. You would have thought that when you take and clean up craziness in your community, the community leaders would be excited. The city fathers would say, well, you know what? I heard this man Jesus coming, but man, he cleaned up, at least that part of the community, because we had a mental health case that none of us handle. But what it turned out to be is the mental health case was actually the cover they had for what would be the equivalent of crime and crack in our communities. Sometimes people like dysfunction because it hides their agenda, because they were taking advantage of that. So Jesus knew the recovering of sight and recovering of mental health was not just the physical issue. He said, when I straighten out that guy's life, I'm going to pull back the cover on all the other stuff that was happening underneath that. There's some economic issues that was happening, some political issues, some spiritual issues, and I want people to see all of it. When that man in the tombs got his right mind back, the stock market crashed because the pigs he was fronting for and covering jumped in the water. The pig profits sunk. why should Jews be dealing with pig prophets anyway if they're kosher? Well, the crazy man was covering it, right? So the sight came to the community, hey, there's swine in Palestine. And the city fathers got upset. And you read the rest of the text, it says they ran Jesus out of the community and told him, you can't come back here no more. Why? He's helping recover sight to the fact that people were taking advantage of mentally ill people. Are we not doing that today? Are we not? I mean, again, in the John 9 text, the young boy was blind. He was taking advantage of young adults who can't see. I don't mean no disrespect, but we got some of the most blind young adults I ever seen in my life. Sorry, Justin. But I'm just saying, they can't see their way to get a job. They can't see their way to earn their own money. They can't see their way to get up early and work. They can see their way to take what you got and find out how come you ain't giving it to them. They can see how what looks like what's good for you ought to have, and they want it right now. I ain't saying everybody. I'm just saying in general, there just seems to be this problem of wanting everything now, or this self-entitlement kind of thing that says, hey, you know, and for those who give it to them, we have crippled a generation of people who didn't learn how to earn it or how to get it in a way that would actually help keep our communities growing. Because if I give you the fish but didn't teach you how to fish, then I'm going to keep you begging somebody for fish. At some point, I need to teach you how to put the pole in the water and sit there and pull the fish out for yourself. Then you don't need me no more. Cut out the middleman. You know, James Brown, old song, I don't want nobody to give me nothing. Open the door, I get it myself. That self-help type mentality is what Jesus was trying to empower people to stand on their own. And to recover one's sight means if I can help you see, you won't need me no more. Mm-hmm. How many of us are really trying to work our way out of a job? I mean, I wasn't trying to be my kids, you know, quote unquote, daddy for life, right? I mean, I'm gonna be your father forever, but I'm not gonna be your provider for life. Then I didn't do my job. Mm-hmm. I'm not gonna be your, you know what I mean? So again, as you was talking about, at some age, you ought to be growing.
That's right.
So that you can start providing that for somebody yourself. You know, one of the joys I had of recent was seeing Deacon Meredith's son standing at the altar at the blessing of his own son. I ain't seen Deacon Meredith smile that big, standing up looking, you know what? Why? Because grandbabies do that to you. You know, Leah, they do that to you at an age where you can see the fruit of your labor doing that. Now, if after he comes, brings that child, bless, etc., then he leaves the child with the mama and he go back to the house talking about, okay, Dad, what we eating tonight? No, you need to go and first of all, feed your child. And then you figure out how you're going to eat after that. You know, et cetera, because I've raised you now to be a meal provider. Mm-hmm. Your days of being fed are over. That's right. Now, you might come over for Thanksgiving, you know, or your birthday or something. Occasion a meal and have a blessing. But this everyday thing is done. And if you don't get that, let me help you see that. Let me help recover your sight. Somebody ought to push a like button on that one. That's pretty good. See, because we leave our children blind to the process because we let them birth babies and then come back to us. Mm. What is that about? No, we've got to own our own community. The fight over what's happening about, for instance, the educational system, etc., shouldn't that be by old school civil rights groups from the 60s? That shouldn't be the front line fight over what DeSantis has just tried to do with the Department of Education. That's a young people's fight, because it's your future and your children that's going to affect. They can't miseducate me. I've been educated. Mm-hmm. See, here's the beauty of education, whether it be Bible study, Christian education, whatever education you want. If you're in the right place, and that's why you tuned into the right station, we're teaching you to become critical thinkers, fishers for yourself. And once you've been educated and learned how to see, can't nobody unsee you. Once you learn to read for yourself, teach for yourself, study for yourself, nobody can make you ignorant again. That if you are, it's willful. The only thing that can take that away from you now is something called dementia or Alzheimer's or something. And even Alzheimer's people remember some things. So my introduction to the text basically suggested that the challenge was they were trying to go to the boy's parents to get them to speak for him to keep him dumb. Like, you speak for this boy because he's saying the wrong stuff. Mm-hmm. But the best thing the parent says in the text is, he is of age. Go back and ask him to tell his own story. So here's the shift. You talked about the age of a baby ought to be able to walk. Mm-hmm. You said, I think if I heard you right, 6 months, you're precocious if you can, 7, 8 months, you're able to deal with that. But if you 2 years old and you still ain't walking, then we need to be talking to you, taking you to the podiatrist or somebody, right? Yeah. If you 10 years old and you still crawling, you know, by wise, you know, sucking your fingers, and, you know, asking for your bottle and, you know, grabbing your mama's, you know, breast, you know, trying to get your milk, you know, there's some public shame to that, ought be.
Yes, yes.
What does a Christian who is at that stage spiritually look like, and what ought we do to that, about that kind of malady, Reverend Carr? Because you're a master teacher, you are a person who understand that, but what do we do with the spiritual ignorance that we need to be recovering the sight of people for and help them to see? How do we deal with that in light of the text? Because the he is of age thing is the piece that grabs me. I mean, how does that ring for you?
Yeah. Well, you know, again, going back to that analogy, a big part of success in the Christian life is the walk of faith, living by faith.
Okay.
Right? The Bible says that it's about faith from beginning to the end, and I think that's one of the things that many believers miss, right? Trusting in the Lord with all their heart, leaning not to their own understanding, walking by faith. The currency of the kingdom of God is faith. Just like the currency of the kingdom of man is cash and credit. In the kingdom of God is faith and trust. You don't get anything done without faith. And so, first of all, I think we have to, when we see that lack of walking by faith, we have to address it. We got to let people know you don't fulfill purpose and mission unless you're going to walk by faith. And faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And that's just one area, but that's a big area. Again, in the natural, if you see somebody not walking, you know, the baby starts out, and it's all right because they're a babe in life. They start out, they're barely moving, but that's okay initially. But at some point, they got to start wiggling. You know, our faith got to wiggle a little bit, you know. And then at some point, if they're developing right, they're gonna start doing some crawling.
And here's the thing: once you start getting up on your feet, they're going to do some falling.
Yeah, they're going to do some falling.
That's part of the stage of growth. Don't think it bad because you get up and fall down a few times, or you take a few steps and you don't go very far. People are afraid of that stage.
Right.
It's kind of like in golf. People are like, man, I would come out and play with you, Rev, but I need to play. I want to be able to play. You can't get as good as where I am if you ain't willing to look bad for a while. I'm just saying, you don't just go from top golf to, a single-digit handicap. You got to go through some stages of looking back. You're going to miss some shots. And pros look bad. Pros have bad days. You never get to a place where you perfect the game totally. You got to keep working at it, and what makes you professional or more professional is how willing are you to work at your craft and how long are you willing to perfect it. It's true about everything in life. You can never be a student of the word if you ain't going to read it, study it, come to Bible class, dig in it, ask questions, and make some mistakes. Yeah, you're going to fall sometime, but you need to. Right. Whenever a child falls, the first thing they do is look for something sturdy. They don't look for nothing weak. They look for something strong they can pull themselves up on. Right. Or they look for their mama, you know what I mean, or a parent or somebody, they can throw their hands up to say, pick me up, I'm tired of falling right now. Now, there's some spiritual imagery in that, right? So falling ain't the problem, but go to something foundational. Get back to the word. If you've done something and you feel like you are in there or you're not sure about your steps or your faith, get in the word. Or find a spiritual leader or parent that can actually help pick you up until you can put you back down. If you watch a child, they'll hold on to mom for a while, do that, and after a while they'll squirm like, I want to get back down, try it again. So mom put them back down, and then they go running off, so then they fall, and they come back again. But there's a stage for that. Yep. But Christians want to get picked up and don't ever want to try it again. But at some point, we got to learn how to faith walk.
Yep. And then there's another one, Dr. Bland, is not only the walk of faith, but the talk of prayer.
Okay, talk about that one.
Yeah. So the talk of prayer is that at some point in your Christian experience, you got to be able to go to God for yourself and talk to God. You know how babies do.
For yourself.
The parents got to explain what little Junior was saying to folk. No, here's what he said. No, Junior got to articulate himself. Wow. You got to be able to go to God for yourself. Ask and it shall be given. Seeking you. So somewhere along the lines, you're struggling in the area of prayer, but at some point, you got to become proficient in talking to God for yourself. Wow. That's a part of the growth.
That's big.
Not only the walk of faith, but the talk of prayer. At some point, God, he tolerates it at first, but at some point, God expecting you to come to him